Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much, guys. You got a lot of information on me, Jesse. I don't know where you found all that, but anyway, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Paul Gray. I work for Audubon, Florida. My main job is working with Lake Okeechobee and issues of, you guys have all heard about algae blooms and estuary dumps, and everybody's always fighting over Okeechobee. And I'll get to that at the end of this talk, but what I want to talk about is kind of the history of ornithology in North America, which obviously it's 500 years, so I'm going to have to kind of be brief. But some of the early ornithologists who helped found what we know now, I've always had an interest in how they figured out what birds were in America, because that was a big, no one really knew. And then I'll go forward as to how ornithology developed and also how the Audubon societies started developing. And they were, of course, developed to try to protect birds from a lot of stuff. And so after I work through that stuff, then I will go to my program, the Okeechobee Watershed Program, and I'll talk about some of the early Audubon wardens that preceded me working on Okeechobee, and then finish off briefly with some of the stuff that's going on right now that we're trying to work on. So it's a lot to cover. Hopefully you can stay awake. Okay. All right. So of course, Columbus got here in 1492, but the age of exploration, that's when the Europeans finally had those big sailing ships. And in the 1400s, they were going around Africa, and they made it around the Horn of Africa to India and stuff. And they were going and finding, exotic places and things. And one of the things that they had on all the sailing ships were scientists, and they weren't scientists like we think of today, where they were some kind of a specialist on insects. They were a generalist who did everything. And Charles Darwin, when he was on the Beagle, he was one of those scientists. And the job of those guys was to document what they found when they went there. And it's like, is there a big forest we can go cut down? Are there good soils we can go plant sugarcane? Are there minerals like, Spain famously got a bunch of silver out of Peru. So they were trying to go back to their home country in Europe. And, this is an imperialistic age, and say, hey, we can make a lot of money if we go back to this place and exploit it. So part of what they did was they cataloged birds and stuff. These are some of the earliest images of a towhee in America. And these are from two different books, but don't they look kind of the same? There was just so little information back then that it was really important. Anything that you saw was important. The first fairly good book about the natural history of the US was from Mark Catsby in 1754. And if you ever look up the species name of a bullfrog, it's Rana catesbiensis. And so it was named after Mark. And he wrote a pretty good book with a lot of pictures of birds and fish and plants and stuff from the New World. And of course, this was back in the 1700s. You had to do a print, and then you had to hand color all these images. But his pictures were better than his descriptions. He'd just have a couple sentences about, I saw this along a river. And, you didn't really learn much about the birds. Here's a Carolina parakeet that he rendered. Actually pretty nice renderings. And this gets back to bird art. Art and birds go together because they didn't have cameras back then. You always had to draw things and then try to put them in books. So the first guy who really did a whole lot of cataloging was George Louis Leclerc, and he got a title Comte de Buffon, and that's something like the mayor of the city or something like that. But he was French, and all these sailing ships were coming back to France, and they were bringing all these specimens. And so he was able to catalog tons of them, and he wrote like 30 volumes of work. His work was characterized by a lot of errors, because sometimes the specimens would come to him and they weren't even labeled, and he'd have to guess what continent they came from. Of course, when they get back to him, they had been dried out, and some of them weren't in very good shape. So the soft colors, like on the bill and the legs, weren't very good. But he actually did a really good job of just, trying to get an idea. Here's all these things in the world. And one of the things he noticed, and this was 100 years before Darwin made his theory of evolution, is there's real similar species in other continents. Like the European green-winged teal is like our American green-winged teal, but they're a little bit different. And, we used to have our common gallinule called the common moorhen, because moorhens were in Europe and they thought ours was the same, but they're a little bit different. And they have the great purple heron and we have the great blue heron. And so he realized that there might be common ancestors. And being French and being romantic, he concluded that France had the best of everything. And all these other specimens from around the world were degenerate forms of it. And that really incensed a lot of people in other countries. Thomas Jefferson was so mad at him that he had written that American animals weren't nearly as large and majestic as European ones. He had some guys go shoot a moose and send it to him because the moose is the biggest ungulate in the world. But anyway, in spite of his few shortcomings, he really did a lot of work. But the first real American that worked in America, actually Wilson was Scottish, but he immigrated to America. He wrote the American Ornithology in 1810 to 1814. And this was the first really good work on birds. He wrote detailed descriptions of their life history. There was a lot of confusion back then because, you know, you think about when you're going in the woods, we have a field guide nowadays and we can look up something, but they were just seeing these birds. And like, if you think about the Orioles, there's a male and a female, they're very differently colored. And then the first year males and females sometimes are different from the adults. And then they also molt from their bright plumage to their dull plumage. And so, you know, the early naturalists had all these different species of Orioles, and Wilson actually kept them in cages and watched them through their molts and was able to figure that stuff out in 1810. And I got this print because of this beautiful bird here, the yellow-winged sparrow, which is the grasshopper sparrow, which I work a lot on, but I had to pay extra for all these gaudy birds that nobody really cares about. But this is an actual print out of his book. He may have hand colored it himself. So this is 200 years old and I have it hanging in my office. And Wilson hated Buffon too. He was really incensed that Buffon would say our birds were degenerate. And so one of the things he did, you know, notice this is Wilson's black skimmer, and it's got orange legs like you see, and it's got the red bill. And, you know, again, Buffon couldn't possibly know that. He also couldn't see a lot of these birds in life. So he drew them in awkward positions because Buffon had never seen them alive. So Wilson wanted to differentiate himself from Buffon. And one of the things he did was in the corner of all of his etchings, it says drawn from nature by Alexander Wilson. And that is a signature that says, you know, I'm not sitting in a museum somewhere in Europe. I'm actually here, you know, looking at the birds in life and giving you a much better accounting of it. And this was such a powerful message that when Audubon did his work 20 years later, he also wrote Drawn from Nature by John James Audubon. And so Wilson, his illustrations were they were just illustrations. They were almost like field guide illustrations. I mean, you could see he could paint pretty well when he wanted to, but a lot of these just look like field guide plates because he was trying to get people to identify birds. See, even the tails turned a little bit so you can see the white rectrices. So anyway, he was a very good science. People marveled at how much he was able to learn. And his American Ornithology, when he wrote it, was hailed by many people as the greatest scientific work out of the Americas ever. Even some of the Europeans said it was better. But anyway, so he died as he was finishing it and never got to know how much people appreciated his work. And if you don't think you have heard of Wilson, what's this bird right here? Wilson's warbler. What kind of snipe do we have? Wilson's snipe, Wilson's phalarope, Wilson's storm petrel, Wilson's
mama.
Warbler. Yeah. And so there's more birds named after Alexander Wilson in North America than there are after any other person. Of course, when you come first, you get that. But then came John James Audubon about 20 years later. And those two actually met one time when Wilson was traveling, but Audubon was much younger. And Audubon had a vision that he wanted to paint all the birds life size. You can see his art was much more flamboyant. It was mentioned that that snipe print was by Havel in London. When Audubon showed up from the wilderness with all these big, gorgeous paintings, he went to Philadelphia, which was the intellectual capital of the United States, and they pretty much ran him out of town because his work was going to compete with Wilson's, and Wilson's was a favorite son of Philadelphia. And it's kind of fortunate they did because he went to Europe and worked with Havel, and their printing and other graphical techniques were actually more refined than Americans. And so a lot of these artistic features on these birds that they were able to do. So in one sense, maybe it was a blessing in disguise. And the Europeans just absolutely loved him. And he came back to America and finally won acceptance for his great art and for some of his science. And when you're drawing life-size birds, you know, this is how big the book is. This is really a huge, it's not a field guide. And you look at the poses of like some of the pelicans and great blue herons, and they're kind of twisted up. Well, he was drawing them life size. And so to get something that big on a page like this, he had to kind of contort their bodies. but nonetheless, it was a monumental work that everybody was like, wow, what a deal. And just really beautiful stuff. This one hangs in my office. Just really nice art. And dramatic poses, and he also often had snakes fighting with birds and things like that. So he had dramatic art too. And back then, it was hard to get specimens. And so here is Alexander Wilson's original kite. And notice Audubon's is just a mirror image of it. He was plagiarizing from Wilson because you couldn't always find stuff. And Wilson was so prominent that he did misidentify a couple birds, and Audubon put them in his book too, saying, I've seen them too. So the competition was fierce. So after Audubon, in the mid 1850s, the Smithsonian started, and the American Museum of Natural History in New York was started, and there were a few universities that started to have professors. And we went into a hyper taxonomic phase. Everybody's trying to figure out what birds there were. And Wilson had identified like 250 birds, and Audubon added about 50 more. And of course, once we got west, we added a whole nother set of birds. But those guys are just out shooting birds and measuring them, and they were drawing the toenails on every single bird and the beak. And this Ridgway's manual is about 3 inches thick, and there's like 100 pages of diagrams like this. It's just really a lot of dead birds and measurements. And it was shotgun ornithology. They didn't have very good optical equipment back then. And of course, if you're going to draw it, you need to shoot it. And so these are some historic guns that I've collected. This is a flintlock. This is the same gun that John James Audubon and Alexander Wilson both were shooting. It's a double barrel. And this gun has, it's called a flintlock. So here's the lock. Here's the stock. What's that? The barrel. Lock, stock, and barrel. That saying comes from this gun. And there's a little pan here that when you shoot it, you put your flint in there and it chips and it makes a spark, and the spark goes in the pan. And there's a little hole that goes into the shooting chamber. And if you try to shoot your gun and the pan flashes, but the gun doesn't go off, what are you? You're a flash in the pan. And then the other thing is these hammers, they cock halfway and the trigger won't pull. And so if you go off half cocked, what have you done? So there's 3 sayings: going off half cocked, a flash in the pan, and lock, stock, and barrel that come from this gun. This second gun is more of a modern shotgun. This little button will open it up and it looks like a double barrel. And this was from the 1870s. And this was a great invention because you could finally use cartridges. This little gun is called a Flaubert, and it's a parlor shooting gun. It shoots essentially little 22 caps. And when Cuthbert shot out the Cuthbert Rookery down in the Everglades, he reportedly used one of these guns because they're quiet and they won't kill things for more than about 15 feet. But when he would go in, instead of, the big boom that you get from the shotgun or this gun, it's just a snap and it wouldn't scare all the birds away. So this is one of the guns that they used to shoot out the rookeries. And then this little portable hunting pistol, this is a marble game getter. Herbert Stoddard, the guy who is responsible for tall timbers getting started, used to carry this when he traveled around the country. The stock folds, the bottom barrel is a shotgun barrel, the top one's a rifle barrel. And anyway, so all these guns were made for hunting birds, and all the ornithologists had guns all over the place. And so John James Audubon did not start the Audubon societies, but they were named after him. And this is his crested caracaras that he got up near St. Augustine. And when he did his write-up on this, see the red on the beak and the head? He wrote, that as soon as he shot these birds, that started fading. So he's glad he had, the bird fresh in hand. So Audubon societies got named after this guy, George Bird Grinnell, and he was the editor of Forest and Stream magazine, which nowadays is Field and Stream. And he was tutored by Audubon's widow, Lucy Audubon, when he was a kid. And so he formed what was the very first thing called an Audubon Society. And he mailed out pamphlets to kids. And within 4 years, he had something like 50,000 subscribers. And it got to be too much for him. This is kids back, in 1886. So he gave it up. And then later there were some women who started naming Audubon societies in different states. Here's a picture of Frank Chapman. I'm going to come back to Chapman several times. He was at the American Museum of Natural History, and he was very prominent in the bird conservation movement early on as an ornithologist, not as much as an activist. And so if you want to know who really started Audubon, it's women. This is Clara Dombrich. If you go to Orlando, you can go to Dombrich Drive. Her husband was a very wealthy businessman in the Orlando area. And she called the first meeting of the Florida Audubon Society. And it was mostly wives of very prominent people. The governor of Florida was an honorary board member. Teddy Roosevelt was an honorary board member. I think the president of Rollins College was a board member. And, you know, all the wealthy businessmen. And so women back then, of course, they couldn't vote. It was frowned upon for them working, but they formed these Audubon societies, and they were originally concerned about bird protection and how bad it was to just shoot plume birds just to pluck feathers out of them. But you don't hear about the women because back then it was man's world. And so people like Gilbert Pearson, who I'll get to in a minute, you know, he was the face of Audubon, but really the strength of Audubon was behind him. And that's reflected in this cartoon of Frank Chapman with all of his women following him around. And here's one scolding a boy for shooting birds. But anyway, there are a few people that realized that women were very, very important in this. And in America, we weren't the only ones having this fight. Across the pond, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, they also were concerned about birds being shot for style. And, you know, birds of paradise were being brought back on ships and made into stuff. And so they were fighting a parallel fight in Europe to protect birds from, you know, slaughter. Okay, this guy, Joseph Batty. This is a real person. And it kind of illustrates the links between collectors and plume hunters and museums and stuff like that. This is, you know, courtesy of the American Museum of Natural History, and is obviously a posed photo. But Batty, for one thing, wrote this book called Practical Taxidermy and Home Decoration. When was this? 1880. And so what he wrote in here was, you know, as Americans are getting wealthier and we're getting a little bit more leisure, you know, what home doesn't look better with a pair of Baltimore Orioles mounted on your firewood hearth or something like that. And this book is actually a very detailed book about what kind of guns to shoot, how to stuff a bird, how to make a frame, how to skin mammals, how to mount skulls. He even gets into gun safety and has recommendations for if you're going to spend the winter at a cabin, you need to have at least 2 acres of forest around you to keep warm. And anyway, so this whole book was about trying to decorate your home with dead animals. But Batty had another role, and it had to do with plume hunting. And so this is a snowy egret, obviously, and they were the very prized bird. And so there's a guy named W.E.D. Scott, and he came to Florida in the 1860s and went around the Everglades and documented those mega wading bird nesting colonies, which had 1 million nesting birds in them, or whatever the number was. And then he went back 20 years later in the 1880s, and they were all shot out. And he was just mortified. And so he wrote about it in the scientific journal saying, you know, these Floridians are shooting all the birds. They're just getting slaughtered. And so he was one of the first people to really bring attention to this in a credible way. And when he got to Fort Myers, he heard that there was a plume hunter outside of Fort Myers hunting on a sandbar, shooting wading birds and stuff and shorebirds. And he went out there, and it was Batty. And Batty told him that he had 60 hunters that were working for him up and down the Gulf Coast who were shooting birds. And so it was, anyway, W.E.D. Scott came back and reported that. And it ended up, Batty got hired by the Museum of Natural History, and they sent him to South America to get birds for their collections, get him out of the plume business. And when he died, there was an obituary for him in the ornithological journals. And it said, you know, he was employed in the unfortunate plume business for a while, but he was a great resource and colleague. So small world. And so Chapman wrote a lot of the early field guides and stuff like that. And this is just a picture of a guy that shot a bird, but in Chapman's Handbook of Birds in, I think, 1895, he wrote one about the snowy egret. And here's his description of the snowy egret. The curse of beauty has numbered the days of this most dainty and graceful of herons. 20 years ago, it was abundant in the South. Now it is the rarest of its family. The delicate egrets, which it donned as a nuptial dress, were its death warrant. Women demanded from the bird its wedding plumes, and man has supplied the demand. The Florida herons have gone, and now he is pursuing the helpless birds to the uttermost parts of the earth. Mercilessly, they are shot down at their roosts or nesting grounds, the coveted feathers stripped from their backs, the carcasses are left to rot, while the young in the nest above are starving. But then, you know, the little bunch of egrets in yonder jaunty bonnet is so pretty, so becoming. I mean, this isn't science. He's mad. And this was in the late 1800s, as we pretty much wiped out the plume birds from the Everglades that early. And that's what a lot of the early Audubon movement was, is let's stop doing that. And so here are a couple birds from Princeton. And if you notice who shot them, W.E.D. Scott. So he was down here collecting when he was talking to Batty and those guys and getting birds. And this was from a museum that a museum display that Ann Paul with Tampa Audubon had. And there's a manual taxonomy by Maynard where you can learn how to stuff birds and stuff like that. So all these guys were shooting birds, but at different rates. And so Chapman also wrote in his Camps and Cruises book, of these birds, herons, egrets, ibis, spoonbills, and others, the state once possessed a marvelous store, be it said to Florida's everlasting disgrace, that until the honorable industry of shooting birds at their nests became no longer profitable, she raised no hand to save herself from being despoiled of this rich heritage. Even then, the passage of laws was secured only through influence from without. The laws, however, were not observed, and all efforts to secure conviction under them failed. And so they were trying to pass laws and trying to stop the plume hunting, but even when you got laws passed, they didn't always get enforced. And again, Frank's mad. So in comes T. Gilbert Pearson. He was the second president of Audubon, but really the most influential. He was in for the National Associations of Audubon Societies. And one of the things that they were doing, and of course, Florida's Audubon, I think I founded in either 1900 or 1895, but there had been laws passed to protect birds in North America. You know, even in the 1700s, they were trying to protect heath hens, which of course went extinct. And they were trying to make laws. And so Chapman and the guys in the ornithological societies would write laws to say you can't shoot this and that. But there's so many common names around the nation that you couldn't identify all the birds you weren't supposed to shoot because everybody called them something different. And so they made a model law, and it's the present framework of how we hunt now. They said, we're going to identify game species, and you can shoot game species, but you can't shoot anything else. If it's not on this list, you can't shoot it. And what they were was ducks and geese, the grouse family, quails and pheasants and, you know, grouse and turkeys. And then the snipe and the woodcock made it on, but most of the other shorebirds did not. And of course, doves are on there. And Florida adopted the model law in 1901. And if you read Pearson's memoir, his autobiography, he goes, yeah, I went down to Florida and I went in and introduced the model law, and the Florida legislature adopted it. And then I went to South Carolina and they adopted it there. And then I went to Virginia and they adopted it there. And then I went to New York. And I was just thinking, how could this nerdy scientist guy just go into a state legislature in 1900 and say, hey, well, I want you to adopt this law that tells your people they can't shoot birds that they're used to shooting. Well, it was before I knew about the women in Audubon and how influential and how strong they were. The pillow talk and the highest levels of those states had already greased the skids for him. And so when he got there, the women all had it ready so that it was going to pass. So again, he just writes, oh, I did all this stuff, but really there's a lot of people behind him. And so one of the things that Audubon did to try to help get the laws enforced, now that we have the laws passed, was we would hire people and pay their salary, and then they would be deputized by the state, and they would go out and enforce game laws. And so you've probably heard of Guy Bradley. He was killed in the Everglades by plume hunters. Columbus McLeod was killed in your region. They never found his body, but they found his boat with blood in it, and so he was apparently murdered. There was a warden in South Carolina that got killed. The warden on Orange Lake near Gainesville got shot but didn't die. But it was rough and tumble stuff, and these guys were giving their lives for protecting birds 100 years ago. And Paul Kroegel, this is the contract. All you need to see is $1 per month was his salary. And he was the first warden on Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. And Pelican Island, this is a diorama of Pelican Island in the American Museum of Natural History, and it was done by Frank Chapman. And Chapman was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt. And Chapman said, could you protect this island? Can you make it a refuge or something? And so Teddy Roosevelt started the National Wildlife Refuge System because of his contacts with Chapman and with the ornithological societies. And, Frank just really loved this island. And so that started the National Wildlife Refuge System. And again, Audubon gave us hunting laws, they gave us the refuge system, or they helped inspire it. And so here's Chapman, and when he was on the Sebastian River over near Fort Pierce, and he's talking about Carolina parakeets. And he says, at an early hour, they left their roost in the hummock bordering the river and passed out into the pines to feed. Always, so far as I observed, selecting thick thistle patches and eating the seeds only when in the milky stage. About 10 o'clock, they returned to the hummock and apparently to some favorite tree, here to pass the rest of the morning and early afternoon when they again started out to feed, returning to the roost just before sunset. A flock of these birds feeding among the thistles is the most beautiful and animated sight. One is almost persuaded, not to disturb them. There's constant movement as they fly from plant to plant, or when securing thistles, they fly with them in their bills to a neighboring tree, there to dissect them at their leisure. The loud rolling call was apparently uttered only when on the wing, but when at rest or feeding, there's a loud conversational murmur of half-articulate querulous notes and calls. I mean, just a really nice little vignette of the Carolina parakeets he was seeing on the Sebastian River. So if you read this label, Florida, Sebastian River, Frank Chapman. He was a museum guy. And when he was down here, he shot these guys and he wrote in his notes that he felt really bad about. And if he saw some more, he might just leave them alone. But a couple of weeks later, he did see some more and he shot them too. And in some ways, maybe it was good because they were going out anyway. And we do have some specimens left of them and we can study them, at least in hindsight. But again, shotgun ornithology. And this is at the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park in Okeechobee County. And this is from the Lost Bird Project. And this artist, Todd McGrain, made 5 statues of extinct birds, and he put them the last place they were seen. And this was the last place the Carolina parakeets were seen because a guy named Charles Doe collected their eggs. And so this statue is here, and Todd's motto is, because forgetting is a second extinction. And so there's a Labrador duck in New York, a passenger pigeon in Michigan, a heath hen on Martha's Vineyard, a great auk on some Newfoundland island. And recently they added a Eskimo curlew down in Texas. So if you ever get near one of these places, this is pretty neat to see these statues. And he has a traveling exhibit that goes around Florida too. So it might come to somewhere near you at some point. Okay, so here's Chapman's Handbook again, 1895. You notice it's key. And how are you going to figure out those bird feet if you don't shoot the bird? Basically, you can't. So they would shoot it and then try to identify it. But this was bothering a lot of the ornithologists. They were thinking, maybe we're too heavy with the gun and not looking at enough other stuff. And so one of the things he did was he made this color field guide in 1903. And it doesn't have all the colors because in 1903 printing technology wasn't much, but he was trying to get people to see birds and not shoot them. And if you can see the screen very closely, look, Florida yellowthroat, Pacific yellowthroat, northern yellowthroat, salt marsh yellowthroat, blending yellowthroat. So this was back in the age of extreme splitting by ornithologists. Now, we don't have that many varieties. But he was trying to get people to move away from it. And so was W.E.D. Scott. In his later part of life, he said, we should start studying their behavior rather than just their taxonomy. And so anyway, they were trying to move forward and get people out of this idea that every time you saw a bird, bang, bang. And so in Florida bird life, Howell said the long and unremitting and finally triumphant struggle of the National Association of Audubon Societies for the rescue from extinction of the plume birds of Florida presents a record probably unparalleled in the annals of conservation in this or any other century. No organization has encountered more disappointment and discouragement, and none has ever overcome them with more success. And it's interesting because once we got the plume hunting stopped, the Everglades plume birds did recover. And I'm going to be showing some pictures from Helen Cruikshank that were from the 1930s and early 40s. And when they were at Cuthbert Rookery, there were hundreds of thousands of birds nesting there again. So Audubon actually was successful in stopping the plume hunting and letting those bird populations recover. And that's important. Okay, this is me in 1938. My name's Marvin Chandler. I'm the very first warden on Lake Okeechobee. That second belt buckle on the left is his badge. Now this is not his badge, this is someone else's badge. But he was actually carried a badge and gun. And he had been out on Okeechobee with the Crookshanks photographing glossy ibises, because back then 95% of all the known glossy ibis nests in the country were on Lake Okeechobee, and they couldn't get around this water moccasin on their way back. And so they killed it. It was 5 foot 11 inches. See how fat it is? In its stomach, it had a glossy ibis egg, 3 tricolored heron eggs, a digested egg. It had a baby American egret and an adult glossy ibis. So if you find a water moccasin, they're fun to play with. But one of the things the governor and cabinet did was they were establishing sanctuaries around the state that Audubon could protect. And so these are the Okeechobee Sanctuaries that were established in 1938, and they're still in existence. They're more symbolic than anything, but part of my job on Okeechobee is protecting these sanctuaries. And so this gave him authority to go out on the lake and arrest people and stuff like that. And you can see there were quite a few sanctuaries around the state. Here's his boat. I get an airboat nowadays, which is a lot easier. And here they are out in the water carrying all their photography equipment. And here's a glossy ibis. And nowadays they're a pretty common sight. Back then there were maybe only 1,500 of them in the whole country. So that's another conservation success that a lot of people don't even realize we've had. And the citizens of Okeechobee wrote in support of the sanctuaries. They said, "We value the business which the society brings to our community. We believe in the work of the society and wish to cooperate." And so when I first took the Audubon job working in Okeechobee County, and I was going to be a conservation person working in Cowtown, I was kind of nervous about the way I'd be treated by the locals, but they all liked Audubon, and I was just flabbergasted. I didn't know about all this Chandler history, and having 60 years of Chandler family working for Audubon and working with the community. So they did a lot before I even knew they were there. And so here's Marvin looking at a pail of eggs. I mentioned Charles Doe, the guy who got the last Carolina parakeet eggs out of the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve. He never got them. He never got this batch of eggs because I guess when he came back, the locals thought he wasn't paying them enough or had a disagreement with him and threatened to kill him if he ever came back. So he never came and got them. And so Marvin and those guys picked these eggs up and put them in a museum somewhere or something like that. But so this is 1930s. There was still an egg trade going on. And, he'd have local ranch boys or farm boys go out and, find a bird nest, get the eggs. And so, and anyway. And this is Rod Chandler, Marvin's nephew, and he's looking up this tree. And what he's looking at are these spikes. And these spikes were probably from Doe, and this was a caracara nest tree. And so what the Chandlers would do is as soon as the caracaras would lay an egg, they'd run out, climb up the tree, and stamp the egg property of the National Audubon Society. And that way, if Doe put it in his collection, someone would know he had obtained it through nefarious means. And here he is. He had a collection up in Gainesville. And so collecting back then wasn't quite as regulated as it is now. And so, these guys were part outlaws and part conservationists and part hoarders, whatever. But that was just the way things were going. And these are the Nichols Brothers. If you read the old Florida Field Naturalists, they're full of articles from these guys. They also were collecting and egg collecting and they were ornithologists, but it wasn't the type of ornithology we do nowadays. Oh, and I see the photos by Sam Grimes. We'll get to Sam in a minute. There's Marvin with his horse. I have a truck now. Okay, he was followed by his nephew, Glenn, and Glenn worked for quite a few years. Glenn took Roger Torrey Peterson out on the lake, and he and Sam Grimes had found a cattle egret nest. And the cattle egret nest was the very first one in North America. And so Roger Torrey Peterson, when he was there in the 1940s, wrote a chapter about Lake Okeechobee. And I was so excited to read it because I wanted to hear what the lake looked like in 1940. And all Peterson could talk about was cattle egrets. He was like, "Oh, it's so fabulous to see a cattle egret nest." And I was just like, "Oh, good grief." But anyway, so we have this nice drawing by Roger Torrey. And then after Glenn left, his brother Rod took over. Here he is in the Fort Drum Swamp looking for Carolina parakeets with Noel Snyder, who wrote the book on Carolina parakeets. But again, these Chandlers were doing conservation work back when it wasn't cool. And this is a map of the Kissimmee Prairie region. And here's Lake Okeechobee, and here's the Kissimmee River, and Lake Kissimmee's up here. And by the way, I live right here on the north side of Lake Okeechobee. This is that's right where I'm sitting right now. But these pink blocks are Audubon Warden records of wading bird nesting colonies. And you notice they're clustered, right up here around the prairie. And there used to be, this was pre-drainage. They were going around in the 40s before we drained everything. And there were huge wetlands out there that would cover several square miles. The birds would nest in them. And so those records were really important for, even now we use them for Kissimmee River restoration metrics and stuff like that to see if we can restore that type of landscape connectivity. And this is the prairie. So not only they were patrolling Lake Okeechobee, but they were patrolling the prairie. And if you've ever been out to the dry prairie, you can tell it's prairie. It's very short, but it's also surprisingly to most people, it's an old growth ecosystem. And so if you look at this dark green spot, this is a oak tree. And we're used to oak trees growing a trunk and then sprouting out for their crown, but the prairie gets struck by so much lightning. We think it used to burn every 1 or 2 years. And so oak trees really couldn't get established. And so this is called a runner oak. And if you were to go out and pull up any individual stem out here, you'll find it connected to the next one and the next one and the next one. And so in order to grow in this high fire environment, this oak tree spreads out under the ground and then sends up expendable material. And in some similar oaks out in Texas, the San Chenery oak, they think some of those things may be 200 acres in size, a third of a square mile, and 10 to 20,000 years old. And so this oak, we haven't done the homework on it. I don't know how big or how old it is, but these things could be thousands of years old. And also the saw palmettos, they grow big clumps. And we've now gotten research from Archibald Biological Station that they'll be 5,000 or 10,000 years old. And so this is, and just as much as a redwood forest, it's an old growth ecosystem, but it's short. And even these clumps of grass, they have more root mass under the ground than they have above because of the fire system, but they can be 100 years old. So it's been kind of sad. We haven't valued prairies for what they are, and we've lost a lot of them, but thank goodness we've been able to conserve some of them. And this gets back to Audubon. This is a picture of the Kissimmee Prairie Sanctuary, or the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park again. It's 50,000 acres of native cover. And part of the reason we were up there is 5 endemic prairie birds. Here's the Florida sandhill crane, Florida's mottled duck, Audubon's crested caracara, the Florida burrowing owl, and the star of the show, the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And the grasshoppers are the only ones that seem to have pristine prairie. They don't persist very well on improved pastures, which, most of the prairie has been converted because you can get a lot more cattle on that. There are some examples of some improved pasture that they're persisting on, but usually they disappear from those habitats after a while. Now, all these other guys can use the improved pasture, and some of them have pretty high density. So these guys aren't as tied to the native prairie. And you may have heard about Florida grasshopper sparrows. Their population has really declined greatly in the last 20 years. And I work a lot on them. That's a whole different talk, but there's a captive breeding program, and we're letting go a lot of sparrows right now, just the last 2 years. And the released sparrows are surviving and they are breeding. And so we're pretty confident we're going to be able to bolster their populations back up. I've been sweating over that bird for decades. Okay, and one more thing, back to this map. This is the old Audubon Sanctuary, and it's in this red circle. And this is the sanctuary that Rod Chandler told Audubon. He said, everybody's plowing the prairie under, and if we're going to save the prairie, we need to buy some. And so back in 1980, Audubon bought the Kissimmee Prairie Sanctuary. It's about 7,000 acres, 11 square miles. And when I took this job, there was a proposal in to buy this tract right here, which is the biggest tract of dry prairie left. And so I more or less worked for Nature Conservancy because they were the land buyers back then. And we were able to get that bought. And now it's the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. And really what touched my heart was Rod Chandler lived long enough to see that. And he came to all these meetings and said, oh, you're doing such great work. And I'm like, Rod, I just got here at the last minute. It was Audubon that put us in a position. And this was the first time the state had ever bought prairie for the intention of saving prairie. And again, it's a very Audubon story. And it's kind of fun to be part of that heritage. And by the way, Dick Poe was in in Okeechobee in the 1940s going on these bird tours. And so when he became the president of the Nature Conservancy. And when we went to him and said, hey, we want to buy some prairie in Florida, he knew exactly what we were talking about. And so he helped us get a grant to buy that first tract of prairie. And this is a letter he wrote to us. It's hard to read, but we had to write him a letter because we sold the sanctuary to the state to become part of the preserve. And we wanted to make sure we had his blessing. And he says, I will feel good that Good Hills Grant was the key to what is now a 50,000 acre preserve. So he was just happy about it. And he was about 100 years old when he wrote this letter too. But anyway, so I stand on the shoulders of giants. Okay, now we'll switch to Okeechobee a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about restoration work and wrap it up. So here's Okeechobee when things are nice. There's a snail kite out there. You have Eleochris. There's a lot of stories about how Okeechobee is so polluted and everything. And that's true, but basically 1/3 of the lake is marshes. And even when the middle is very polluted, the marshes can still be just beautiful. And of course, there's Max Stone's famous photo. He planted these snails in the water and had to wait for days, but finally the kites started coming and taking them. Notice how long their talons are. That's to be able to grasp these round shells because that's all they eat is snails. And that hooked bill, of course, is it fits into the snail shell and can cut the columnar muscle so they can pull out the meat. So that's a bird that I work a lot with too on Okeechobee. All these little beauties are banded on Lake Okeechobee. They're neotropical migrants. They're almost all warblers. I think there's a vireo in there somewhere. And all these were banded on Lake Okeechobee. And some of them were banded like in October, and in the next October, they were caught again in the same little island on Lake Okeechobee. These were by Tyler Beck of FWC. And I point these out to show that, these neotropical migrants, they spend the winter out on the Caribbean islands and in South America and Central America. And when they go across the Gulf of Mexico, they've got to get really fat. They've got to make it all the way. And they weigh about as much as 4 pennies, but when they get fat, they weigh as much as 8 pennies. They double their body weight. And then they fly all the way across the ocean. And so it's really important when they get here that they have a lot of food that they can tank up on quick and then fill up their tank. And so these are midges this is in Lake Istapoga. And if they get to a spot like this, they could get fat in a hurry because there's just, if you look at all these midges, they just cover these leads. And so it's important for us to keep the Everglades healthy, not just for the birds of Florida, but for the birds of North America. We have all these migrants coming through here, and we're the last gas station on the way out, and we're the first one on the way back. So we have oversized importance when it comes to bird conservation. And, we all like trees because they're birds because they're pretty and they sing, but they put some tents over trees in Missouri. And here you see this yellow warbler with a caterpillar. Anybody who gardens knows what those guys can do. And what happened is the trees that didn't have birds in them were losing about 1/4 of their leaves. And the trees right next to them in the forest, which didn't have bird protection, were only losing about 13%. And it significantly slowed the growth of those trees. And there have been a lot of different experiments that followed up and done this. And basically, you take birds out of the wild and bugs become a problem. And what this says is if you're a forester in Pennsylvania or Nova Scotia, you care if these birds come back because your trees will slow down if they don't, and you'll make less money. And most people don't realize that, the health of the Everglades actually matters to their forest and their woodlot in New England, but they do. And that's part of the reason we tell everybody from around the country when we go to Congress for funding for Everglades restoration, this matters to you too, because your birds depend on our state as well as your state. And you look at Florida, we're the proverbial neck of a funnel. Not everybody comes through Florida, but a lot of birds do. And again, we have outsized importance to this huge continent of birds that get into our state and then have to make it out and back. Okay, so here's what's happened to our state. This is an infrared map, and you can see the Everglades agricultural area where all the sugar farms are and stuff. This is a big development going in for a citrus grove. This is the mining district over near Bartow. All this yellow is improved pasture. This green stuff is native cover, but you can just see how the state's getting all changed and buggered up. So, and this is the drainage system that they built to try to drain South Florida. And we're trying to do Everglades restoration to update this system because it's from the 1940s and we're not in the 1940s anymore. So that's what I work a lot on is water. And what they did to drain the state, we asked them to, it's 1940s. We had floods that you could go in a kayak from Orlando to Miami with no trouble. And we asked the Corps, will you drain the state? They said, yeah, the quickest way to drain it's not trying to get all this water down to Florida Bay. It's dump it down the St. Lucie, dump it down the Caloosahatchee. And what it did was it dried out the Everglades. And so now they don't get enough water. These guys famously get way too much water. And the Everglades also is a recharge for the Biscayne aquifer. So they have saltwater intrusion problems. And so we're trying to restore the Everglades by, instead of dumping all the water, we're going to try to get it back to the Everglades. We'll recharge that aquifer. We'll make the Everglades healthier. We'll spare the estuaries to the extent we can. And that's the goal for the future of Central South Florida water. And this is the Cyanobacteria blooms on the lake a couple years ago. You probably heard about it. This is the middle of the lake blowing up. And this photo is from July, and I'm going to take you back into the Audubon Sanctuaries, right about where that arrow is, to look at what else was going on. But this is not what we want to have going on in any of our water bodies in our state. So first, we're going to look. This is the Martin County Health Department on the left. That's the city of Stewart. Warning: high bacteria and blue-green algae level. Warning: avoid contact with water in the St. Lucie River. And on the other side, the Caloosahatchee, stay out of the water. No drinking, algae alert. This is not the sign that any chamber of commerce anywhere wants on their boat ramps. We are a water state, and people is famous for swimming and fishing and tourism and bird watching. And so this is just not a good future condition. So we got to clean this stuff up, not just for the birds, but for us. And so here's just a montage of things about Okeechobee. But this picture down the lower left, see how he's got his hands down the water? It's about 6 inches deep. This is in July when that algae picture showed the whole middle of the lake blowing up. And look at how clear that water is. Then it's clear because we're 2 miles from the open water. We're way back in the marsh. And the marsh cleans the water. So this water is 10 parts per billion, 5 parts per billion phosphorus. You can drink it. And when I'd take journalists out on the lake, because they wanted to know about the algae bloom, I'd also run them back here and I'd get out of the boat and drink the water to freak them out. But that's kind of the thing about Okeechobee is it's so big that even when some parts of it are really harmed, other parts can be really good. The fishery in it, we can catch 1 million crappie a year out of Okeechobee, which is more than the entire rest of the state. And of course, there's birds and fish, and it's a South Florida treasure. And this is how it gets depicted. As a toilet, and the estuaries are sewers, and that's funny, but it hurts my feelings. So how are we going to fix it? Well, we need to store a bunch of water. We've overdrained the system, and when we dump all that water during the big hurricanes, as soon as the drought starts, we're out of water because we threw it all away. And so what we want to do is build systems where we can catch water somewhere outside the lake. And so when it's wet, the lake doesn't get too deep and start that bad cascade of events. And then if you have it stored, you can run it through some kind of a cleaning system, like a filter marsh. And so when it goes on, it's not polluted. And then if we can slow it down and clean it, then we can convey it back to the Everglades rather than dumping it in that emergency fashion. And that really, right there, that's Everglades restoration. I mean, there's a lot of details, but that's basically what we're trying to do, is just find ways to catch that water beneficially rather than have this out of control system we have now. And so here's a busy schematic, but north of the lake, these are some projects that they're looking at trying to store water. On the Caloosahatchee side, this is going to be a big reservoir to try to catch water and give the estuary water when it needs it, but catch water when it doesn't need it. On the St. Lucie side, here's a big reservoir and filter marsh. And notice how much water that can hold compared to the small size of this estuary. And then in the Everglades agricultural area, they're building the A2 STA right now. And this is, we're trying to get that one done. So these projects are underway. They take a decade and they cost billions of dollars because it's so much water. But this is what we're trying to do to try to restore these ecosystems. And so when birds come south and when birds go north, they'll be safe and happy and well fed. And here's the Kissimmee River channel to drain that floodplain. There's very little wetland value there. And this was in 2015. And so this project is almost done. We hope to complete all the construction this spring, and this summer, the whole river will be operational. You can see the old channel right here, and you can see, and think about this water. It's not going down a super highway of a channel. It's just kind of slowly meandering through this wetland system. It's getting clean, getting filtered. and it's providing habitat. And so here, this habitat restoration project is helping us with our water management problems. And so to the extent we can, we want to work north of the lake, not only to build a reservoir or something, but can we restore wetlands? Can we rehydrate the watershed? And so one thing is, this is the old way we did agriculture. There's no room for a bird out there. There's no room for an extra drop of rainwater. It all gets pumped off with all of its constituents in it. And here's a modern design where we respect the wetland features and we leave them there, because those guys told me, this is Nichols Brothers, they said, even if we drain that wetland, the trees never grow out there because it's still a low spot and it's still too wet for citrus. So here we can do intensive agriculture and feed humans, but here we have natural and semi-natural lands that still retain value. And you know, if we can pay these guys, say, plug your ditches and keep this thing wet, and you know, if we're spending money on a reservoir, we can spend money on you to get water storage too. And so that's part of what we work a lot on, is trying to find ways to rehydrate the watershed. Here's cows in the background. Here's a wetland. Obviously, there's something of interest to these egrets. And if we can get these guys to plug their ditches, either through easements or buying water rights or something, that we want to do that all across the watershed. And when it rains, when a hurricane comes, instead of this water glugging into Okeechobee, it just sits there. It's not rocket science. And here's a big restoration project for the St. Lucie project. Here it was dry. Here we've reflooded it again. What's wrong with that? And by the way, people can still run cows out there. You just run them seasonally, but as it starts to dry down, you put them out there and you put them on drier land during the wet season. And so I'm going to close it now. This is some white ibises nesting on Bumblebee Island on Lake Okeechobee. And when I climbed up the tree to try to get this picture, I said, boy, this looks just like the diorama that I've seen Frank Chapman do. And then I realized, no, the diorama looks like this. This is what he was trying to recreate. So I'll stop talking and open it up to questions. I know I kind of went fast, but there's a lot to talk about.